It's so nice to see so many non-digital versions of all of you this morning. As grateful as I am for the technology that got us through this last year, it's wonderful to be here together in person. And I'll apologize in advance, having to be this close to the microphone. If I lose my place in the manuscript, there's not a lot of room to see what I'm saying here. But again, thank you all for being here today. And happy May Day and Beltane Day yesterday, Cinco de Mayo coming up. A wonderful week of celebrations. Yesterday, we paused to celebrate International Workers' Day. It commemorates when, on May 1st, 1886, more than 300,000 workers in 13,000 businesses all across the United States walked off their jobs in the first May Day celebration in history. It's difficult to overestimate the importance of workers and the labor movement, not just for our economy, but for our communities and our homes and our lives. The 8-hour workday changed not just factories and offices, but also the time we had for ourselves, our free time, and the time we spent at home with our loved ones and friends. If you've forgotten or never learned the history, it might surprise you to know that 100-hour work weeks were common even into the late 1800s, 100-hour work weeks. Overtime pay wasn't approved until 1938 when the Fair Labor and Standards Act passed, and you couldn't even assume that your employer would be held accountable to providing safe working conditions until the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970 and the Federal Mine Safety and Health Act of 1977. Labor rights are recent history. All of these gains had to be won through courageous and creative organizing. And while it's true that we have lost some ground when it comes to wage stagnation and union membership, organizing to secure a minimum wage that is also a living wage is ongoing, and it's grounded in this rich history. It was the same 1938 Fair Labor and Standards Act that both established a minimum wage and limited child labor federally. It took decades of persistent and sometimes violent struggle to reduce some of the economic exploitation that was so common in the United States. A popular pamphlet distributed ahead of that May 1st, 1886 action read in somewhat shocking language, "Working men to arms, war to the palace, peace to the cottage, and death to luxurious idleness. The wage system is the only cause of the world's misery. It is supported by the rich classes, and to destroy it, they must be either made to work or die. 1 pound, brace yourself, 1 pound of dynamite is better than a bushel of ballots. Make your demand for 8 hours with weapons in your hands to meet the capitalistic bloodhounds, police, and militia in proper manner." So you might be shocked or disagree with the strength of the language and the convictions, but you should remember, always remember, that those were in response to violent exploitation. Such a poster or social media post today would probably earn you an uncomfortable visit from a government agent. But none of those words would have been spoken or deeds done if oppressors would have just been reasonable and supported economic, social, and environmental justice. Working people had to fight for their lives and their rights, and our lives are better because of the labor movement, unions, and workers. Hopefully, because the work is still ongoing, our descendants will look back with a similar appreciation for our own times. I confess I may have some bias here. I'm the child of a factory worker. I've worked in the fast food industry as a day laborer on farms and vineyards, as a construction worker, and as a roofer. And I've spent, as most of you know, a significant chunk of the last 10 years of my life as an unpaid caregiver. Community, the work of sustaining human lives, that is work. And a lot of it is manual labor. Working people, paid and unpaid, are essential, and our labor is beautiful. All labor should be treated with dignity and respect. So it's not a small thing that President Biden signed an executive order last Monday that created a task force focused on how to use existing federal policies and programs to help workers organize and collectively bargain in the public and private sectors. Or that he included the PRO Act in his address to Congress last Wednesday, saying, quoting, "The American Jobs Plan is a blue-collar blueprint to build America." That's what it says. And it recognizes something I've always said. The guys and women on Wall Street didn't build this country. The middle class built this country. We might amend that to the working class built this country. And unions build the middle class, and that's why I'm calling on Congress to pass the Protect the Right to Organize Act, the PRO Act, and send it to my desk to support the right to unionize. By the way, while you're thinking about sending things to my desk, let's raise the minimum wage to $15. This is especially significant in the midst of this pandemic year, when the whole world witnessed a powerful reminder of the importance of the worker, paid or unpaid, in creating and sustaining human society. We wouldn't be here without them. It is imperative to remember, as Kim Kelly wrote, quote, "Who exactly kept the world turning while the government twiddled its thumbs and the super rich raked in record profits?" Which brings us to the importance of this very moment. Many of us in the United States have recently breathed a little sigh of relief. We endured a year-long nightmare watching the pandemic being mishandled with tragic results. We continue to manage the constant stress of trying to keep everyone, especially vulnerable people and essential workers, as safe as possible. And we continue to grieve the hundreds of thousands who have suffered and died. To be able to see just a little glimmer of hope, such as when we finally reached important milestones in vaccinations and saw fatalities start to decline in the last few months, that's been so important. When I received my own COVID vaccination, I remember thinking for the first time, my goodness, human beings might actually survive this. I felt so sad, and I felt so happy at the same time, recalling all the suffering that we've been through this last year, and then daring to hope that we might be turning a corner. At the same time, we know our work is far from over. The U.S. still has a long way to go, it's true, and Springfield is hovering right around 32% vaccination rate. We have a lot of work, but we're also watching the same disparities and tragedies unfold around the world. Brazil and India have been particularly hard hit. The latter, India, passed the 200,000 official death mark this week, and actually unrecorded deaths probably make that number much, much higher. And it will continue. Those difficulties will get worse. They've had over 300,000 new cases of COVID each day, and they've passed the 18 million cases, official cases mark. Meanwhile, oxygen supplies, that very breath of life, they're critically low, and it's fueled a black market in exchange for vital resources. Thankfully, we now also have some news of people mobilizing to get oxygen to India, but it's still a extremely difficult situation, and the images of emergency crematoriums have filled our news headlines. What doesn't get spoken of as often is the context for this tragedy. Oxfam, the international NGO, released a very important report in January, and if you enjoy reading things like this, I really encourage it. It's an excellent report to read, and the link will be in the manuscript that's posted on our sermon website. The report was named the Inequality Virus, and it covers a lot of ground in over 80 pages, but one of the themes is that the rich and powerful are exploiting the pandemic to, guess what, become even more rich and powerful. Their survey of economists revealed that 87% of economists that responded think that the pandemic is going to increase income inequality in their country. And 56% think that's going to increase gender inequality. Many of the key insights detailed in that report connect these trends in a way that show that debt burden, austerity measures, and structural adjustments have, in their words, hollowed out public spending and health systems. The result is that user fees and out-of-pocket health costs have skyrocketed and have made healthcare out of reach for the poor and marginalized. I'm sure you recognize the same kind of trends here in the United States. But it is also a driving force in India and a driving force behind the tragedies that are unfolding there now. India is in the bottom fourth in terms of health budget as a government expenditure, and its citizens, in the words of the report, pay for more than 70% of health expenses themselves. This has created a situation where only 50% of the population can even access basic health care, because only people who can afford out-of-pocket expenses can afford health care. The result is poor health outcomes and an increased risk of death during the pandemic. The report reviewed data from 147 countries that suggested that when private healthcare expenditures are 10% higher, then COVID deaths are 4.9% higher. That should be a really shocking statistic, and it should really get a lot of attention. I haven't heard it anywhere else, though, but when healthcare expenditures are 10% higher, the COVID death rates have been nearly 5% higher. And it reminds us again that healthcare is a human right, and we need to treat it as such. The report also detailed that 90% of nations reported that essential health services were disrupted by the pandemic. Poor and working class people rely on those services the most, of course. And so they've been faced with the difficult choice between choosing financial stress in order to go into debt, in order to access health care, or rolling the dice and just hoping everything turns out okay. The wealthy, on the other hand, well, they just access private health care on their own without interruption. This is what's commonly called a two-tier healthcare system, and the Oxfam report gave an example of South Africa for this, where public health care serves 84% of the country, but only has access to 30% of the doctors. That kind of inequality is just, I don't even know what the word is for it. It's outlandish and outrageous and unjust. It's 84% of the country's population is served by the public health care, but only 30% of the doctors work in public health care. These are the kinds of things that we're talking about when we keep saying that the pandemic has highlighted the injustices that already existed in our societies. In the Oxfam report's words, all over the world, health outcomes are strongly determined by pre-existing social and economic inequalities. The poor, for example, are more likely to be exposed to COVID-19 because they often live in crowded conditions. They tend to have less reliable or no access to clean water or to sanitation services. They're more likely to have essential jobs that make them more vulnerable, or to lose jobs if they take leave in order to care for a sick family member, or to make sure they themselves don't get sick. The Oxfam report wrote, studies from several countries show that COVID-19 infection and mortality rates have a clear social gradient. COVID-19 mortality in the most deprived 10% of areas in England is twice as high of the least deprived 10%. Similar trends have been reported in other countries such as France, Brazil, Nepal, Spain, and India. We could, and the report does, highlight the other ways oppressive systems like racism, sexism, gender and sexuality phobias, disability injustice, make the pandemic even more catastrophic. Social and economic injustice and the disparities they create are deadly, and the pandemic has amplified their deadliness. There are no silver linings to such injustices and tragedy. There is no way to make it okay. A significant percentage of the illness and death would never have happened if our societies were organized in healthy, just, equitable, inclusive, and compassionate ways. Greed, hatred, and delusion are powerful motivators, and the pandemic has powerfully revealed to more people than ever that this is the world humans have collectively created. But we've also seen that this is not the only world that we have created. And this is the good news part, right? I'm cautiously optimistic that more and more humans are becoming aware that things don't have to be this way at all. In April, the Pew Research Center published a report that indicates a great opportunity for us to act right now if we're able to act. While support for major economic changes continues to be divided, and that's not surprising, 19% somewhat and 75% of U.S. respondents strongly supported the proposition that the national government provide more job and skills training. 34% somewhat and 44% strongly supported an increase in public housing. That's 78% who favor public housing increases. 30% somewhat and 47% strongly supported expanded government benefits for the poor. That's 77% of people who are in favor of more benefits and social programming. Moreover, and this one surprised me a little bit, happily surprised me, 25% somewhat and 45% strongly supported increasing taxes on the wealthy. That is a huge indication of broad support for social programming with the potential to impact the roots of oppressive systems. I think these were some of the kinds of shifts that were on David Graeber's mind before his unexpected death last September. He pointed out that a similar shift in attitudes happened after the 2008 financial crisis, which provoked what he called a brief moment of questioning. I'd like to quote a paragraph from his essay he wrote last September. "The window was almost instantly shut by those insisting we shut up, stop thinking, and get back to work, or at least start looking for it. Last time, most of us fell for it. This time, it is critical that we do not. Because in reality, the crisis we just experienced was waking from a dream, a confrontation with the actual reality of human life, which is that we are a collection of fragile beings taking care of one another, and that those who do the lion's share of this care, work that keeps us alive, are overtaxed, underpaid, and daily humiliated, and that a very large proportion of the population don't do anything at all but spin fantasies, extract rents, and generally get in the way of those who are making, fixing, moving, and transporting things or tending to the needs of other living beings. It is imperative," he wrote, "that we do not slip back into a reality where all this makes some sort of inexplicable sense, the way senseless things so often do in dreams." Those words can bring us back to lessons we continually have been reminded of throughout the pandemic, maybe most notably and especially of how interconnected we all are, whether we like it or not. We remembered that we not only share the same air, but we also share the same manufacturers and trade partners, and a disruption in one place could lead to the death of a person in another place. Just as a new policy that opened up funding or distribution in one area could save a life of someone somewhere else. Similarly, both social and ecological justice issues have reminded us that our worlds are intimately connected, even if we have created artificial boundaries that give the illusion that harmful actions don't have consequences. The torrent of anti-trans legislation all around the USA has stirred not just fear, but also solidarity in communities all over the nation. And the Black Lives Matter movement continues to unmask the cruel lie of white supremacy and challenges us to observe and dismantle racial injustice in our own cities, in our organizations, in our homes, and in our hearts. For many people, the pandemic pulled that thread of the illusion that we can separate our personal well-being from our neighbor's well-being, from a stranger's well-being, even from an enemy's well-being, or even the well-being of the earth itself, because we can't. Graeber's wonderful description of humans as a collection of fragile beings taking care of one another points us to the possibility that, we can organize society in a way that values mutual respect and prioritizes mutual care. Many indigenous communities have always been organized along these lines, and marginalized communities have also done this and will continue to do this just in order to survive. Collective care is an act of resistance in a society organized around greed and violence, subverting oppressive norms and creating space for genuinely just and equitable communities to emerge. These responses, usually organized by marginalized communities for marginalized communities, are typically called mutual aid. Mutual aid is a really simple concept. Instead of responding to a crisis or oppression with fear and greed that creates more scarcity, instead, we can respond with sharing with one another and supporting one another. Mutual aid emphasizes solidarity in a way that charity typically does not, as well as self-determination and collective liberation. Mutual aid networks often operate with a keen awareness of the systems that produce injustice and try to redistribute resources, dismantle oppressive systems, and cultivate communities where people can thrive. There are so many examples that we are a collection of fragile beings taking care of one another during just this past year, a combination of charity and mutual aid that has helped people cope and survive. To get a glimpse of how widespread this community organizing has been during the pandemic, I visited the Mutual Aid Disaster Relief website's resource page, and they've collected 551 distinct websites representing autonomous and self-organized projects, ranging from how-to manuals to volunteer sign-up forms. There are instructions for how to sew cloth masks, how to set up grief support groups, how to advocate for prisoners during the pandemic, how to organize for tenants' rights, support immigrants, organize food banks, manage quarantine needs, and so much more. 45 states and Washington, D.C. had individual entries, plus Canada, Europe, and the wider world. It's going on everywhere. As extensive as that list is, it is still incomplete. I know that because none of the mutual aid networks I personally have participated in or known about during the last year are included on that list. For example, the Sweet and Mutual Aid Fund collected and distributed donations to transgender and queer folks in Missouri, knowing that the pandemic was going to worsen challenges in employment, housing, and food security. Friends of the Glow Center established the Cutie BIPOC Emergency Fund for the same reason. Meanwhile, a broad coalition of organizations and volunteers mobilized to provide emergency housing and food to thousands of people, much of it using the Connecting Grounds as a hub. Since most places to get out of the weather were closed during the pandemic, it became basically illegal to be homeless here in Springfield. So we organized to set up day shelters and rent hotel rooms. Then as cold weather set in, crisis cold weather shelters opened, and at least 2 empty church buildings were turned into life-saving places of warmth. Springfield Tenants Unite mobilized resources to help people fight illegal evictions and connect people with safe housing. And there are at least 2 mutual aid networks in the Springfield area that I know about that are diligent about getting essential and life-saving items to people as they are needed: the Southwest Missouri Solidarity Network and Touch One, Touch All. In the midst of all the suffering, we humans still dared to care for one another and insist that another world was possible. When Jenny Zhang, writing for Harper's Bazaar, asked mutual aid organizers about their dreams, she wrote that the answers often involve gardens, communal space, fresh water, unpolluted air, land that is nurtured, not extracted from, accessible, nutritious food, homes people can afford without fear of eviction or displacement, meaningful systems of care instead of carceral punishment, self-determination, and basic human dignity. To some, she wrote, the work might seem immense, to do what entire systems of governments have never been able to do. Ultimately, it's worth it, Messia Sweetgrass, an organizer on the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming, says, as Little Wind nods in agreement. It's not a hassle. I want us to actually feel accountable for one another's wellness. I want to reestablish a sense of care and love through understanding, wow, I'm so interconnected to everyone's safety and to everyone's healing. So here we are, carrying all this grief and carrying all this possibility. This is the opposite of greed and hatred. a sense of responsibility and accountability grounded in compassion, care, and love. I want us, Sweetgrass said, to actually feel accountable to one another's wellness. I want to establish a sense of care and love. This is our way forward if we are willing. It can't be assumed. Most of us are exhausted, and this year has especially taken a toll on our well-being individually and collectively. Our lives have always been made up of loss, and we haven't even begun to process the grief and pain of this last year. As we read in our meditation together, from the pandemic to the perils of climate change, from impeachment trials to Capitol riots, from police brutality to anti-trans violence and more, we have borne so much suffering and grief. But we've also witnessed wonderful acts of creativity, compassion, wisdom, and community. And we carry both that pain and that joy with us as we take tentative steps toward creating communities of care in a post-pandemic world. This is our ongoing work, to commit ourselves again to creating communities where compassion, justice, and joy can thrive. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.